one of the things that I wanted to do was kind of in a sense put a topic at the center, of our dialogue, and and use this Joe Rogan Will Storr clip, because I think that we're scratching the surface of something as community becomes global, as we scale out, people have become more disconnected. And that's a very real problem. Like
Uh-huh.
the digital environment has a way of isolating people. Like that's a very real reality. And yet there's a response to that. There seems to be a response to that in what either we're doing here in TLC, or even like exploring how the church utilizes sort of digital media to maintain connection. And I think one of the questions that I have is like, as community scales, can we still sustain a level of intimacy? And I would think that, like, if you and I were meeting in person right now, if we were just sitting down at a coffee shop, I think our the level of intimacy would increase, but the potential would be that, like, we are limited in our access, let's say, just to information. I don't know where I'm going with this. But because this is digital, it's like our access to information increases, even if the intimacy decreases. And I would think that intimacy just takes longer. If you and I were sitting down at a coffee shop, I could pick up on your mannerisms. I could kind of tell a little bit easier, like, how your day is going, just by your body language, maybe. And so that level of intimacy would increase faster. Whereas online, can we sort of still have a level of intimacy, even if it takes longer to develop that intimacy? Because I would think that part of scaling, maintaining community or intimacy within that community, would have to do with vulnerability and the amount of, like, that we're sharing of ourselves online.
Yeah,
It's like,
for sure.
so, like, we're jumping into this conversation. You and I have never actually just sat down and had a dialogue before, but I've listened to you talk. I kind of have a sense of where you are. And so, in a way, this is what people experienced during the Symbolic World Summit, right? It's like you go up and you meet these people that maybe you've listened to them talk online for hundreds of hours, maybe,
Hmm.
and you feel a deep connection to that person because that person has shared. They've become vulnerable. They've shared their ideas, and yet they don't know you. They've
Yeah.
never met you because there hasn't been an exchange. So there's something to that. I wonder, just about scalability, community, and intimacy.
Well,
That
so I think that's yeah. So I think that's something we're trying to do. Me in particular in TLC, I know I'm seeking to do that with to try to make it as real as the medium will allow. And by real, that's one of those words that fudge or smuggling. The the more real something is, I would say, the more that it integrates all the different relations that make you up as a person. And so part of that would be the physical embodied
yeah.
relationship that you have with people, or like your family or your community, but you can't do that through this medium. And so in whatever way you can, through this medium, make it more real, I think that's something we need to lean into, which is, like you were saying, vulnerability. I think it's confession. I think it's, sometimes having disagreements and fights. Like one of the struggles of this medium is that way more so than in your local life, although you can do it. I mean, technology allows for all this kind of veiling.
Mm-hmm.
Like the combustion engine, you can live 40 minutes away from someone that you go to church with all the time and just drive away from them and go to your house and behind your privacy fence and get away from them. You
Yeah.
couldn't do that in the past. You were
Yeah.
all so much more reliant on people. And so this is just like a further, more extreme version of that. You can really hide if you want to
Mm.
online, but we're trying to do the opposite, I hope.
Yeah. And I think that that's where, um, Yeah, I have a thought that maybe the church is actually a little bit ahead of culture when it comes to the ability to do exactly what we're talking about: create community, generate community, sustain community, and even develop a sense of intimacy within that community.
Like better or worse, I think is often the wrong question. It's just like it's just different. That's something I've
Mhm.
really grown with my understanding of online stuff because you can hide in a family too.
Yep. Well, and exactly, and
Different.
that was it. It is this sense of the real. Is it? I think that the initial question, and I work in student ministry, so I approach that. I have to explain this frequently, and so I sort of experiment with how to explain it with people who don't see the online space as being real, because they'll say, "Well, these kids, right? They're just on their phones all the time." It's like, yeah, they're on their phones all the time. That's a given, almost, and that's not real. It's not real community. Well, it's different community. It is different community, but it's not something that doesn't. It does exist, and I think the clip that I have in my mind from Joe Rogan is like talking about stories that bind us. It's like
Mm.
stories are real. They're just a different kind of real. Like it's not that like I was talking with Neil Daedalus, and I thought he had a fantastic point where he's like, in some ways Harry Potter is more real than I am, because Harry Potter has impacted the lives of far more people. No, nobody knows who
Mm.
I am, right? But all kinds of people were sort of transformed by their interaction with this fictional character, and so in some ways, how do we define? This is the Matrix question. How do we define what is real? And we're definitely onto something. The more we experiment, the better. Well, and I think, when I say we, I think of how God is using the body of Christ in this space, right? And experimenting with ways of utilizing the medium so that instead of isolation, what we actually get is intimacy, community, and proper versions of those things, not the distorted versions of them, not the sort of I don't know, even perverted versions of those, right? There's an interesting thought that I've picked up listening to Joe Rogan about the ability to veil online, right? The ability, and you're 100% right, because one of the ways I try to explain to parents, older generations of people, how students are engaging online is is to address one of their concerns, which is they could meet all kinds of dangerous people online.
Yeah.
I'm like, yes, just like they could going down to the local 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
Like that's what I did as a kid. I hung out. There was a like a small street between a McDonald's, a pizza factory, and a 7-Eleven, and everybody kind of hung out on the two different sides of the sidewalks. There was a mix of friends and a mix of groups of people, and like that's where people got into trouble. And
Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, just like real life, they can meet dangerous people. And in some ways, there is an increased ability to veil, to pretend to be somebody you're not. But one of the things that Joe said recently, I'm kind of thinking about this, is he said that he hopes the internet will make it impossible for people to lie.
Yeah, that's one of my I know you're a huge Rogan fan, and so am I, but that's one of my recurrent pet peeves with Rogan. Um, is because I just think he doesn't understand the nature of consciousness and truth and
Okay.
lies because, you know, just because you can read someone's mind doesn't mean you have again, the person is the nexus and locus of all interpretation. So you can read their mind. Let's say you have their mind written out as a transcript, every conscious thought that they have.
Mm,
You're going to have the same interpretive problems that you have of any text.
right.
That doesn't give you insight into their consciousness and their being. And
Right.
even
Right.
that person has delusions and repressions and unknown things. They lie to themselves.
Right.
Romans 7, Romans 1. So, like, you're not going to, I don't know. It will maybe give us insight into
Mhm.
people's conscious, aware self-delusions and lies,
Hmm.
but it's not going to give us more than that, because
Do
that's
you?
unaccessible to anyone, including the person.
Okay. So and kind of coming back into the idea of intimacy and scale and community. So um, the difference between this conversation that you and I are having and a conversation if you and I were in a coffee shop is if you and I met in physical space in a coffee shop and had this exact same conversation, it would disappear, right? It would disappear into history.
Yeah, I
And
concur.
and maybe 3 to 5 other people might have overheard snippets of our conversation.
Yeah,
And maybe those little bits of the conversation might have hung in their mind for a little while. But anybody who has access to the internet has access now to this conversation.
yeah.
So you have, I mean, I guess billions. How many people have the internet? I'm assuming it's maybe because there's what 6 billion? No, it's 8 billion people on the planet right now.
A lot of poor people have cell phones
Yeah,
and internet.
exactly right. So a lot of people have access to the internet.
Yeah,
And so you've got a lot of eyes and ears and brain and minds interpreting, potentially. Let's say everybody in the world listened to this conversation. They'd all pick up on something in this conversation that I guess in like kind of a distributed cognition sense, if I was lying to you, somebody would pick up on that. Somebody would pick up on a piece, and another person would pick up on another piece, and maybe there'd be this sense of fully being exposed, even if I'm not even consciously trying to deceive you. It's just my own deception is taking place, and I present to you what I believe to be true. Somebody else will pick up on that. I think that's Rogan's point. I don't know that that's
okay.
fully fleshed out, but it's like the idea that once you put it out there for everyone to watch and listen, somebody's going to call you out on your BS.
Yeah, there's some truth to that. What it made me think of is it's almost like our the American model of the juror system.
Okay.
Like that's the principle behind
Yeah.
it, is you
Yeah.
get a completely random assortment of peers and people that live in a vicinity and area, and they are collectively an arbiter of the truth,
Yeah.
or it's a greater,
Right.
we put a greater stake in that they can see the truth that
Yeah.
way together and collectively. And I think that's true. I mean, Rogan's a great example of it. And I know you want to go to the Will Storr clip,
Yeah.
but did you see any of the his conversation with the guy that thinks we faked the moon landings? It was like a recent one, like the second to last one or something. I can't even remember the
Was
guy's
it the
name.
one where they also looked at the nuclear blast footage?
I think so. I mean, I was having such a hard time. Bart Sibrel is the guy's name.
Let
I
me
was
see.
having such a hard time with him because I don't like him. And
See, you can just turn him off. You can just mute him. You don't have to.
yeah, it was why I was continued listening to it though, and I was watching it,
Yes.
is I thought it was Rogan doing somewhat of a brilliant master class, because I mean it's amazing to me that he didn't get frustrated and call him out. Like
Hmm.
he was doing TLC stuff. And that's the weird thing, is I think a lot of TLC stuff we've learned from Rogan. This guy was so obnoxious. Like it was driving him nuts that Rogan was trying to steel man the opposite position that he's trying to present. And he's like,
Right.
well, it could be this or it could be that. And it was just frustrating this guy to no end. And I was just like, what it made me think is like, this guy, this Bart guy, must have zero experience in a medium, in a culture
Mm.
where you are actually trying to steel man or devil's advocate
Right.
or give the opposing viewpoint any credibility. He's just
Yes.
used to tearing things down
Right. That opponent
constantly.
processing
Oh
that
my
that
gosh. I was
we
like,
we
how
bring
could
to
you
the
have
surface here.
any this is the point where I've gotten with TLC, is just like, if you are not in a space that allows for good faith opponent processing, you are in whatever the topic is. Pick the topic.
Hmm.
You are in such a siloed culture war mentality. You have no idea of the credibility of your position.
Yeah.
No idea.
Well, and that's
which is what churches do too, by the way.
yeah, yeah. Well, and that is one of the things that we're seeing with, sort of the internet. It's they sort of silo people, right? And isolate people, and you get into the echo chamber, and you
Certain
never get,
algorithms.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the algorithm sorts people down into the echo chamber, and then eventually even isolates them further, because eventually you're going to say something within that echo chamber that reverberates back, and everybody else goes no, 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 and shuts you down.
Yeah.
And so that is kind of the deep dark opposite end of this digital world that we're in. Is it can be very easy to be isolated, and like we were talking about earlier about people being veiled, you might go into an echo chamber thinking all these people are your friends, only to realize they're not. They're just pretending. Like they're not. That's not really who they are.
They're not. You have
You
this
know,
false identity around this identitarian kind of one unity descriptor marker of which side of this
right.
line do you stand on, and that's what creates this false unity. But it's not a real unity. But the thing is like TLC is the opposite of that. Because of
I think so.
YouTube and Discord and whatever, the thing that unifies us isn't this common identity marker around whatever X topic, because we have so much ideological diversity within TLC, and we probably should. This is even the concern of some people who don't identify as Christians, is
Mhm.
becoming a little too Christian, which I think
Right.
is a legitimate thing. But people have a desire for this. That's the popularity of Rogan's podcast to a huge
Mhm.
degree, I would
Mhm.
argue. But Rogan doesn't have he's promulgating it he spoke to this in with the trigonometry guys. Is there was a point in that conversation where he said explicitly, because they were contrasting the American scene and how much they're really appreciating the Austin American scene versus the UK, because
Mhm.
they were saying it's so cutthroat, it's dog eat dog, it's me against you, it's a scarcity mindset, whereas Rogan has this very like friend based mindset of like,
Right.
I'm looking to support you and encourage you and promote you. And so his comedy podcast world is very kind of it's like a comedy flotilla,
Right.
and it's the same thing we're doing. It's the same
Mhm.
thing.
It's funny because Chad was trying to explore other flotillas,
Yeah.
right? And I really want to see where that experiment goes, because and I think maybe Christian and I were talking about this. It seems like at some point, and again, this is sort of the scale and the Jordan Hall Karen uh, conversation on the meaning code. Did
Yeah,
you
that's
catch
her
that?
show. I don't know if I watched all of theirs or not.
She's talking about how they created this painting with everybody just making one mark, and it starts out in this chaotic
Mm,
mess, and yet she, as the artist, can come in and incorporate it all into a work
yeah,
of beauty.
yeah,
And so you see that happening in society as we sort of expand, as everybody has access to each other. There's all these marks. It's all chaotic, and it become a sort of a mess. And even though people are attempting these sort of flotillas like you're talking about, bringing people together, the thing that unifies them has to be more powerful than our tendency towards chaos as humanity, right? Because even if it's like this is such a strange thing, because it used to be like our culture would bring us together. Our sort of geographical, ethnic culture
yeah.
brought us together, and we existed in tribes and we existed in villages and things like that. And that's a pretty strong force, but even that can't scale sort of beyond that. And now we're in this place where it's a total mix of cultures, and the thing that unifies us, I think, is the Spirit of God. That's my sort of thing about TLC, and that's why I think it will. And I know this could put some pressure on people and create friction. I appreciate the feedback here, but I think it will always tend towards being Christian, because I don't know anything else that could sustain a community. I mean, we're talking about the church. Essentially, it's a unit it's a united whole of diverse parts. It's the body. Um, and so, but comedy would be an interesting one to explore because I think comedy is sort of rooted in reality, maybe more even than like ethnocentric, you know,
For sure it is.
things. I didn't finish my sentence there, but
No, that's like one of the great I mean, this is a fictional story, but it's rooted in a lot of historical writings. But that's kind of the end of this book. Umberto Eco has this book, The Name of the Rose, and it's playing with optics, and it's obviously a riff on that Shakespeare, like, would a rose by any other name be any less sweet? And like, what's in a name? That whole idea. And spoiler alert, I guess. But at the end of the book, what you find out is there's this hidden book. It's set in this 12th century monastery. And there's this hidden book that's kind of in this labyrinth of a library with all these like booby traps and things, because it's meant to protect this book, because this book is so considered to be so dangerous. But it's essentially what it is it's a book based on it's this theoretical book that there's no longer any extant copies, that postulates that creation came out of divine laughter. And it's considered to be it's actually which to a certain kind of mindset is too dangerous, because laughter is involuntary. Laughter is subconscious. Laughter is one of those things that is, I mean, I think it's a very interesting idea, because laughter is arguably something that incorporates, or it's an expression of something that is a much more integrated unity of a person than your just like conscious, focal Sunday school answer awareness.
So what I hear you saying is that God would have to be a trinity in order because somebody one well gosh, I always get in trouble when one person of the Trinity cracks a joke, the other person of the Trinity laughs, and here we have reality.
Well, instead of triggering everyone, all of our monotheistic friends, you could just say that God is fundamentally, like this is what Nate says, a multi-unity. He's fundamentally relational.
Yeah. Well, and G.K. Chesterton sort of talks about that, right? He says, God sort of has this perpetual affinity, that he doesn't get tired of making the daisies, right? That every morning he says to the sun, "Do it again." Like a child never gets tired of being thrown in the air, and every time he just says, "Do it again, do it again, do it again." Yeah. And we've grown old, and our Creator is far younger than we are. Right? Yeah. So as a child, just sort of laughing, and I kind of love that. So maybe there is something to that, and again, I think that Joe Rogan, and I've said this before, but it's an interesting study because I constantly go back to Plato's Republic. And what Socrates proposes is, if we want to examine the soul, we have to blow it up to a scale that we can see, so I can't see into your soul, but I can look at how the city interacts almost like one whole, and then we can kind of diagnose the problems of the city and then zoom back down into our own selves and say, aren't those our problems? So, and maybe the solutions would be the same, which is interesting because I think he proposes that there needs to be a philosopher king, right? And so podcasting is that on another level. It's zooming in to the soul. Again, as more and more people put more and more content out there, as more and more people share, you sort of see more clearly maybe what's going on in humanity. And so Joe has been doing this for a really long time and has had a lot of conversations, right, and has had a lot of feedback about those conversations. I mean, hundreds of millions of people. I mean, I'm sure it's billions of views on his content. And And so there's a technique there. There is that opponent processing that he does. He even does it in between episodes. So I've noticed that um, he brought on Stephen C. Meyer, right?
Yeah.
One of the most Christian people he's ever brought on,
Hmm.
like explicitly Christian. I mean, Stephen C. Meyer is famous for being a apologist and a Christian thinker. And I can't think of anyone else that he brought on. There are certainly Christians who he has brought on, but he brought them on for other reasons. Maybe they're MMA fighters or something like that.
Yeah.
He brought Stephen C. Meyer on to talk about Christian theology. Well, theology from his perspective, which is Christian.
Yeah.
Immediately after that, he had Duncan Trussell on, who's a
Yeah.
really good friend of Joe's. They've talked long, So what does he do? He brings on this totally unknown person who's going to challenge Joe Rogan on some of his, what he believes about God. His immediate next conversation is with a friend that he's had for a long time, and they bring up the Stephen C. Meyer conversation a little bit, and he gets to kind of engage Duncan in that dialogue that he already had with Meyer. And I've seen him do that a few times. Like he brought on this lady to talk about cults recently. And I felt like it followed another one of those. Oh, it was Tucker Carlson.
Who was raised in a cult.
Yeah. So they're both showing up as 10 days ago, which is weird. But, Tucker has this, sort of Christian approach to politics and media and all that. And what does he do? He talks to this other lady about cults who came from this very fundamentalist, like sort of Christian type of cult. Or it was a cult that was using the Bible. Let's call it that.
Yeah.
And so there's that opponent processing. He had Constantine. He had the that's trigonometry, right? Those guys.
Yep.
He's gonna have Jordan Peterson on. So he does this. His podcast, if you look at it from a bird's eye view, is almost an opponent processing experiment.
And it's kind of like his own little TLC, because there's a little bit of that evolving where Paul has talked about this with the new media circuit. Like there was the old media circuit, now there's a new media circuit where you go on trigonometry, you go on Rogan, you go on Jordan Peterson, you go on what's his name, the Chris Williamson, and you do this kind of circuit, which is one thing, but it's also like it's their own little flotilla community thing, because then the conversations come up with other people and they talk about a conversation that happened in the other area of people they all know. And it allows for that kind of pushback, because that happened with Tucker too. The Tucker conversation was cool. I actually really liked a lot of what Tucker had to say. But then they pushed back on what was some point. It was with the trigonometry guys where they were talking about Tucker and that he is just very religious and Christian. They were pushing on something.
Yeah, that he's sort of ideological, or I haven't gotten to the trigonometry one. I've watched some clips and stuff of it, but
anyhow, it's good. Rogan's fantastic at that, because like really, if you end up listening to that moon landing guy, I was just like, it was such great conversational jujitsu, because he handled it so well. I'm first percentile politeness. So even though people consider me being like really welcoming and hospitable, like if you like, it's hard for me to repress stuff if you're annoying me a lot. Like I'll probably want to say it pretty directly at some point.
Right.
And I would just be like, dude, are you open to the possibility of being wrong about this at all? At all? Because if you're not, there's no point in talking.
Right.
Just go just yell at people, which is what everyone else is doing online. But like, if you actually want to have a conversation with someone, you have to be open to learning something, the truth outside the truth you currently apprehend.
Right.
Or Jordan Peterson, that the other person might say something that you don't already know. If all you're wanting to do is colonize everyone to the viewpoint you already have, there's no point in talking to people.
Right. Well, and you see that, a little bit to Joe's point about the media exposing you, right? So like
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah.
see these conversations happening, and I remember like distinctly being frustrated with the Russell Brand, Richard Dawkins conversation,
Mm,
because it was almost like Russell would say something that I thought, man, that's a really good point. That like if I was Richard Dawkins, I'd be kind of taken back by that. But Dawkins would just hit him with the party line,
right.
just ideologically sort of respond.
Yeah.
What it made me think is that, oh, Richard Dawkins can't hear Russell Brand. He can't hear what Russell is actually saying because
Yeah.
he's really trying to hold tight to his sort of ideological principles here.
Right.
He doesn't want to look like a fool on a pretty big platform,
Yeah.
and yet I'm going, I can hear Russell. It doesn't sound like Richard Dawkins can hear Russell very well.
So this is something I want to ask your opinion about. So I've had some conversations with people, and one of my concerns or things that I'm thinking about with TLC and podcast and YouTube is here it comes Neil, but is this mammon piece, is the gaming piece, because
Yeah.
Joe Rogan like I would argue that both Joe Rogan and Paul have something in common in that they weren't trying to do anything
Right.
with their podcast or with their YouTube channel or whatever. They just put something out there and it turned into something and it grew and evolved pretty slow. Like you could look at Rogan now and say like, well, he is what he is. But like, what did he say recently? His show didn't make money for like 5 years or something.
I
I
don't
think he
know.
said that
Oh yeah, yeah,
recently.
yeah. His, like initially.
Yeah. And even then, I mean, whatever, they were selling fleshlights or whatever they were selling. But now, I mean, now he's making a ton of money, but Rogan is still very faithful to the spirit that got him where he is, which is I don't put anybody on my show that I don't inherently want to talk to. Like he can be
Mm,
influenced a little bit with that, but even his friends are pretty tenuous in trying to push someone on the show. Um, and he doesn't listen to the comments. He
mhm,
almost has set himself up to be impervious to audience capture.
mhm.
He doesn't have to because he got to where he is by just following the muse. He doesn't have to play any game. He's not trying to play any game. That is the game that he's doing. Is he's just doing whatever he wants.
Yeah.
I am incredibly cynical that people who are trying to model and follow Jordan Peterson in his wake have the capacity to do that
Right.
because he wasn't even trying to do it. He
Right.
probably built the kind of integrity that he has now just slowly over time to get there.
Yep.
But people, YouTube and all this kind of stuff is trying to game the system. It's honestly why even on my YouTube channel, I mean, I do no production. I don't
Mhm.
even take showers. I mean, I look ridiculous. I don't have good equipment. CW makes fun of me for it. I'm not trying to get subscribers, like all the videos of like you do this to get more clicks.
Mhm.
I'm gonna probably do the opposite.
Mhm.
And part of that is even really intentional in my own way because I don't and I don't even like scale. Like I almost if I
Mm.
can't engage and almost know to a degree the people that are interacting on my channel, it's not even useful to me anymore.
Right.
And
Right.
so I don't know. There's something weird about hitting the record button. I think it's probably incredibly difficult, borderline impossible. It's like a rich man entering the kingdom of heaven for someone to hit the record button and stay authentic, I think, in the true integral sense of
Mhm.
what it is on a screen.
Yeah.
You have to not care about the results.
Yeah.
And I think most people care about the results a lot.
Yeah. Well, and there's a gaming part of that where it's like my end goal is to get subscribers and money and fame and popularity or whatever.
Yeah.
There's a artistry part of that also, or a craftsmanship part of that also, is
Yeah.
there's a tool in front of me and I really want to know how to use it because I
Right.
see people misusing it and exploiting others. And I want to be sort of counterculture to that. This was sort of early on. One of my thoughts about TLC was you could try to purify the, let's say we have an ocean of garbage out there on the internet, which we basically do, and you could
Yeah.
try to purify the ocean by just filtering it out and limiting that content, which some of it certainly should be, or you could just infuse it with fresh water, infuse it with good,
Mhm.
and trust that the good will push out the garbage. And the more good that's on, people will attend to that goodness. And when I say goodness, I don't necessarily mean production value. Although there are probably some people who will not watch this video because it's sort of low production value. Let's say that, man, could we have gotten them interested if we recorded some B-roll, and put an introduction into this thing, and got them kind of somewhat invested so that they could hear this conversation all the way to the end.
Right.
Because that's one thing about sort of the TLC and these types of, it's just, it's not super fun to watch. Like we're just two pictures on a screen. And yet what happens is often the best stuff, the best part of the dialogue comes at the end after you've had the 20 minutes to kind of go into it. And now we're starting to sort of build a web, and we're sort of pulling from the different pieces of the dialogue that we have built up
Yeah.
until this point. But then people never make it to that point, and so they don't see the good. And so they continue to attend to the garbage out there. My other thought, too, about this is, I would love it if every single channel in TLC was monetized. Okay? Now, in the sense that I want YouTube to be paying the people in TLC. I want TLC to plunder the Egyptians. I want TLC to, I'm on a campaign right now to make sure that Christian Baxter gets 500 subs before Paul Vanderklay gets 30,000.
I heard
That's
rumor.
that's one of the goals. And why? I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's just kind of like humorous to me because there's the whole PewDiePie versus T-Series where it was millions and millions of people subbing and stuff like that. But
Just play. It's fun. Why not?
but it's play. Yeah, it is. It's part of the play. And so there is something to that. And I don't know. I think that there is in the sense that all of those things become okay. Like, let's say monetizing your channel in a way becomes okay if there's a bigger picture, if there's a bigger story going on, if there's a bigger purpose, there's a bigger end goal. Why did Israel sort of plunder the Egyptians? Why did the Egyptians eventually cough over all their gold and silver to Israel? Because Israel needed to go build a nation. They needed that, I guess, that gold. Now, of course, what did they do with it? They built an idol out of it, and so that's part of your caution, right? Like we don't want to fall into that same trap of then taking, sort of like God has blessed you with this sort of plundering the Egyptians. Like if YouTube, think of all the churches that have YouTube channels. If all those churches could be monetized and even just get a little bit of money from YouTube into the church, like, I don't know. I guess my hope would be that would be a net good, a net positive. Obviously, the danger there would be that now you're captured, right?
Right.
The gold, you're serving the gold rather than the gold serving you and serving, that the purpose
Right.
that God has intended for it.
So I think part of, I guess to your point, and I think it's true, there's not, and I say this all the time, Christ plays an antichrist. So it's not, or it's being in the world but not of the world. It's there's nothing inherently wrong with having better production or having more universal appeal or something. I suppose it would be like a similar argument of just being like, you're a musician and you're just like, I don't really want to get better at guitar because, it's like, then people are just gonna be into that for the art or something. I don't know. I feel like
it's the big problem of all the punk rock bands, right? It's like, yeah, anti-establishment, we're going to be punk rock, and then the record label comes and says, hey, we'd like to pay you to be punk rock, and they're like, we're not selling out, man. There's no way.
Like, do you know what punk rock means?
But then what do a lot of those punk rock bands do?
Well, right, but I mean that
the ones that you've heard of, I guess.
Right. That inherently is like antithetical. I mean, you
Right.
can't be punk and sign a label.
Right. Yeah, you just can't.
Yeah, really.
I think I'm going to set this up, and I think it'll maybe, let's see. Yes. Okay. See, I'm starting to learn StreamYard a little bit here in the sense that I knew it was going to switch my screen for me.
Nice.
And since I have a little bit of a delay, I have to actually, I finally got a solution of how to like, line things up in post production. But anyway, it's
Okay.
because we're not talking over the coffee shop. We have to deal with these digital technological barriers. Okay, because I know we're coming up on time here.
Yeah, let's do her.
Let's make sure. I want to make sure you can hear this. So if it's really the first few minutes of this, but
Okay.
just let me know that you can hear it. Let me make sure that the audio is not too crazy. That's one thing about StreamYard is I can't see what the levels are.
Yeah.
Which is a bummer. Oh, and then there's this really interesting article. I think I'm going to buy it. By Dagmar Heller, Dialogos, Reflections on the Different Forms of Inter-Christian Dialogue and Their Possibilities for the Church. I think this is very TLC. I might repost it on X or something like that, but maybe we'll have to save that for next time. But it's essentially in different denominations of the church engaging in dialogue and stuff. It's just really, anyway, that's not, I'm getting my ADD is kicking in. Okay.
We could talk a lot about Rogan. You're the biggest Rogan dork I know of in the corner. And I listen to it. I have and do listen to a lot of Rogan. So,
well, and again, for me, it is, Paul pointed this out a while ago. He said, a lot of us are participating in this thing without even knowing it. I was participating in TLC before I knew TLC existed because I was listening to Rogan and going, man, I really wish I could have been there for this conversation because I felt like, man, I wish they had talked about this piece.
yeah.
And then I thought, oh, well, why don't I just record myself talking about that piece and insert it into this dialogue and create a new kind of dialogue? And it was my brother who saw one of my videos and he was like, you have to talk to Paul Vanderklay. He's like, you got to find Paul Vanderklay. And I'm like, I don't know, Paul. What do you mean? He's like, he's doing what you're doing with Joe Rogan, with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
Like,
I remember you talking about that with your brother. What this just made me think of, what Rogan is doing, his idea of like mind reading and all this, and even this flotilla of all these different ideas and commentary. What Rogan is talking about is like when we can see everything, he's talking about a mosaic.
Yeah.
You lay all this stuff out and you'll see this greater pattern, this greater unity where the deception will fall away.
Right.
And what will be seen is the unity behind that deception. I mean, he's talking about mosaics.
Yeah. So even though there might be deception integrated into a part,
right?
When you can see the greater whole, that deception sort of disappears into the background.
Yeah. Or it's like, are you familiar with the Silmarillion? Like the backstory of
the song, the song
of the Anur.
Yeah, the rebellious Melkor's song becomes incorporated into
same thing.
The song. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
That's part of it. Okay. So this may end up being somewhat separate, but because we've talked kind of a lot around this, but I wanted to get your feedback on this because I think it really does pull on some themes that I've heard you talk about, I've heard Paul Vanderklay talk about, or it's sort of like at least in conversation within kind of the TLC. I don't know. It's the collective we. That's what Paul Vanderklay called it. So I'll call it the collective we, not the Borg, but the hive mind, the collective
better we.
The better, yes, the better.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Nobody has any idea how the world works until they plug into a group. And the group has its stories that it tells about how the world works. Every group has its model of what a hero is and this set of beliefs a hero has. And once we've plugged into that group, we orient ourselves towards becoming that person. And, cults are interesting because cults are like all human groups are kind of cults, but looser. So every human group is a status game in the sense that it's a group of people who believe the same things, and there's sort of rules for being part of that group. And the more, the better you become at following those rules and becoming its ideal of self, the higher you rise up that status game. The only difference between cult and a religion and a business and a political group is just that it's much tighter. So the rules are much stricter.
There's a few things in there that stand out to me,
Okay.
but I want to get your feedback.
Well, I mean, what it makes me think of, I don't know, did you hear the live stream where I read this section and posted the video from Alan Moore where he talks about cults? It's on magic and cults. Okay, so I want to read part of this. Can I read part of this? There is some confusion as to what magic actually is. I think this can be cleared up if you just look at the very earliest descriptions of magic. Magic in the earliest form is often referred to as, quote, the art. I believe this is completely literal. I believe that magic is art, and that art, whether it be writing, music, sculpture, or any other form, is literally magic. Art is, like magic, the science of manipulating symbols, words, or images to achieve changes in consciousness. The very language of magic seems to be talking as much about writing or art as it is about supernatural events. A grimoire, for example, the book of spells, is simply a fancy way of saying grammar. Indeed, to cast a spell is simply to spell, to manipulate words, to change people's consciousness. And I believe that this is why an artist or a writer is the closest thing in the contemporary world you are likely to see to a shaman. I believe, now this is the part that it made me think of. I believe that all culture must have arisen from cult. Originally, all the facets of our culture, whether they be in the arts or the sciences, were the provinces of the shaman. The fact that in present times that this magical power has degenerated to the level of cheap entertainment and manipulation is, I think, a tragedy. At the moment, people who are using shamanism and magic to shape our culture are advertisers. Rather than trying to wake people up, their shamanism is used as an opiate, to tranquilize people, to make people more manipulable. Their magic box of television set and their magic words, their jingles, can cause everybody in the country to be thinking the same words and to have the same banal thoughts at the exact same moment. And I mean, he goes on, it's longer, but it's very tied to, I was talking to somebody recently about this too. People just don't understand this. People think they understand things because they're familiar with them, which is my favorite quote from George MacDonald and Lilith. So you think magic or cult is this other thing. Everything's magic. Like you think 500 years ago, you take this and show this screen to someone, what we're doing right now, they'd think this isn't magic. It is magic. Of course it's magic. Right. And everything, culture and cult, they're tied. Yeah. It's just a group story. It's a group narrative, but it's deeper than even a story because it's all arisen from folk, which I did a live stream on, this Tom Waits quote about folk. Everything is folk. Everything.
Well, and I think that I wonder about the application of cult in the sense that Will Storr and Joe Rogan are talking about it, in that, again, as we scale up, as community scales, as we tend towards that chaos that naturally happens with diversity and individuation, the cult, in the sense that they're talking about it, clamps down and becomes sort of tyrannical, a tyrannical version of what you just said, right? And that's like what advertisers are doing. It's like, you buy our thing, you must buy our thing, buy the thing.
They're manipulating their cult magic,
right? And so there is that sense of, in a way, it may be a perversion of culture into a type of cult like that. Like
okay, so can I lay this out? So, like, I think this is very true. Peugeot and Richard Rowland have been talking about this recently, but this is very true. So you have one of my oldest ideas, way before TLC, before YouTube was even that big. I had this idea to write a book called Technological Babel.
Yeah, okay.
And it's very connected to this idea. Lots of people have been talking about Babel now. Jonathan Haidt, like his whole second thing is Babel. The Machine, Paul Kingsnorth, they talk about Babel. Roland and Peugeot have been talking about Babel. But this was my basic idea a long time ago, which I didn't have a lot of words to be able to illustrate it. But as the chaos that you're talking about, as technology increases and scales, that is the Babel, as we are building this tower to the thing, which leads to this confusion and nihilism where nobody can even understand anything, and there's a confusion of language. Like, what does anything mean? Meaning crisis, Babel. It's all connected.
Right.
It's the same thing. The opposite of that is Pentecost.
Yeah.
Where you have a confusion, everybody speaking different languages, but everybody understands one another.
Right.
It's a revelation of meaning amidst diversity. It's not one language. Everybody's speaking different languages.
Yep.
But you can hear each other. That's personalist understanding. That's what that is.
Well, and it's the Spirit of God that unites that moment.
Christ in you. Christ
and
in
it's
me.
the Spirit of God that maintains the individual, the individuation.
Yeah.
Like without, that's what a cult would come in and wipe out your individuation, wipe
Right.
out who you are individually
Yep.
for the sake of control and
Yes.
sort of peace, you know.
Yes.
Um,
Identical replicationism, which churches do
Right,
sometimes.
right.
That's what confessions do, everyone.
But I think exactly. I think that we're seeing exactly what you're like. There is this sort of new Babel, but is there also a type of Pentecost, like where the Spirit of God again is the only, and I'll say person, right? And I'm very clear that the Spirit of God is not a force, but a person able to bring about that type of unity in amongst the diversity, like you just said, preserving their language. Everyone is hearing it in their own, and it's also important that it's their mother language, their native language. That's rehoming them, even though they were sojourners, even though they were on a journey. They reconnected back to that which is home. The Jonathan Pajot episode where they were talking about horror, that horror in its fully fleshed out form is a perversion of reality, so much so you don't know what's home and what's not, what's familiar and what's foe, what's up, what's down. Like, is this even real? It's not just, oh, the spooky thing jumped out of the closet. It's, I've been completely dislocated from my sense of reality or my sense of self, and yet here they are hearing. What are they hearing? The great works of God. They're hearing about the great works of God in their own language, in their native mother language. Yeah.
I have a question for you. So I've heard recently, I mean, I don't know if this is Google Translate now or whatever it is, but there are phones that are capable of, you can just talk to someone in a different language and it translates it automatically. But is that a technological attempt at Pentecost? Or, because this is the issue that I know even from my own biblical studies, and you get the spectrum of like literal word for word translation and paraphrase translations, and this is the problem of translation a little bit, is that, and you can argue about these things endlessly, which the area that I know most intimately are these biblical studies and biblical arguments of exegesis and text, and so. Because that's the thing, is the meaning in the translation. I don't know. It's such a hard issue, because like a friend of mine said, there's some Italian saying, this Russian guy from my church actually said, and it's some Italian saying where it's like an idiom in Italy, but it's like all translators are liars.
All translation is treason.
Yeah. Is that it?
Okay. Yeah. Well, and that's why it's always dangerous to read a Bible that was translated by one person. You want the Bible that has a robust cohort of people all engaging in dialogue and obsessing over how do we translate this word and yet maintain the greatest nearness to the original thing.
Yeah.
I think the key is that the Bible is story. It's not just propositional.
Right.
I think we would be in real trouble if it was just propositional theology.
Yeah, most
but because
of it
it's
isn't.
story, the integrity, the meaning is maintained, even though it has been translated. Now, have we lost some? Yeah, like all translation is treason. I do think that that's true, but God chose to reveal himself through story, which to me was one of the big points to what Will Storr is actually talking about with Joe Rogan. Now, he's looking at it from kind of an atheist perspective. And so he's looking at these as like invented stories. But what if the story has been revealed by the creator? Like that, and what is the story revealing? It's revealing a hero who we do attend to, and as we attend to that hero, we are transformed.
Well,
into
it's
his
like any
likeness.
good story, though. We all know this. Like, if you've heard of any good author talking about writing a story, because it's this mutual emergence and emanation thing.
Right.
If the author of the story, is trying to impose their narrative of how they think things should go in the story too much without letting the characters just naturally evolve and develop, you're not going to write a good story.
Yeah.
And I think God is a good author.
Mm.
He's not imposing from this top-down kind of revelatory, deterministic kind of way what the characters are doing.
Right.
That's not the kind of story God's writing.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the Song of Melkor, right? It's incorporated because God could have wiped out humanity after they chose to rebel. I'm right. He could have been like, I need to preserve my justice, right? I'm preserving my righteousness here. The consequence is death. Okay, death to who? Hold on. I'll die. I'll die instead. I'll die in your place. Right? And by doing that, revealed even more of his character.
Yeah, which wasn't like plan B. That's kind of always my struggle with kind of counterfactuals when people say God could have done this. I'm just like, I don't know. That's this story of this alternate reality that arguably doesn't exist unless you want to posit like infinite realities and parallel universes and things where that reality does exist. Otherwise, it's just theoretical, which is non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
It's just mere potential. Well, I think God did. I don't know. That's kind of an abstract thought, but I think I've said to my buddy Cal many times, the best of all possible worlds. That's kind of that atheist argument that I don't like. Well, God could have just done this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, no, he couldn't have, because he didn't.
Right.
This is the world.
Yeah. So we're highlighting what God did.
Yeah.
Or I guess we're attempting to highlight what God did by presenting a contrasting story to say, well, it could have been this or could have been that.
Right.
But you're right. We could get lost in sort of the 1,000 million, possibilities. But it's just interesting that like you were saying, like God doesn't impose in like a, this, okay. So I don't know, we're coming up on your time here.
Yeah.
The most important, I go back to this A.W. Tozer quote, and I mash it up with a C.S. Lewis, or not a C.S. Lewis, a Francis Schaeffer quote, which is, there's a flow to history and culture rooted in the way people think about God, because what comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. It will determine kind of how you live out the rest of your life. And I think part of my struggle with Christianity early on was always thinking of God as a judge, and of course I was coming out of a punk rock scene, and I was like, God, God's going to judge you or whatever. I'm like, oh, that sucks. I definitely don't want to believe in that God.
Yeah.
And then you realize, God there's this mercy. There's a merciful aspect of that. In that God is, like you were saying, not just imposing top down this kind of, I don't know what you would even call it, like a theological determinism.
Right.
And I'll get in trouble with some of my Reformed brothers and sisters, right? Because
You will talking to me.
I'll push on this free will and sovereignty, because I don't think sovereignty is determinism. I think it's different. I think sovereignty is what you're saying, is that God is able to sovereignly work with. I'm losing my language. It allows the free will exists within God's sovereignty. That's my thought. But again, I've talked myself into this cul-de-sac.
He's non-coercive. He's not. He woos and he wins. He wins your heart. It's just like God is. It's like the bride of Christ. You're in a proper relationship with him. He's not a rapist.
Right.
Yeah. God is not a rapist.
God's not a rapist. Ladies and gentlemen, if you get anything from this conversation, he is the bridegroom. He's not a rapist.
That's right.
And that's the C.S. Lewis line, right? He makes the bride beautiful, right?
Yeah.
He's not drawn to the bride because there's some force, that he can't, he's beholden to this beauty of the bride. No, the bride is not that beautiful currently, but the love of the bridegroom makes her beautiful, makes her into who she's determined. I think, to me, that is a very, I would hope people could see that it's very different from a cult, I guess, to sort of use the Joe Rogan and Will Storr thing, is participating in the church, participating in the body of Christ, be understanding that you are part of the bride of Christ. I'm not the bride of Christ by myself, because one, that makes me feel weird because I'm a guy, but together we are this bride,
Yeah.
and I think we are the bride because of the bridegroom. We're orientated that way.
We are feminine there's a great, there's a Chesterton line at the beginning of this book that I read recently, called Little Big, which is excellent. But at the beginning of one of the first chapters, second or third or something like that, there's this Chesterton line, which is, God is a man, but man is a woman, which is essentially, it's that line. Like we are classically masculine, feminine, dancing, anything. He's the initiator. We are the responder. Like it's the way that it works.
Yeah. I like that. I think that is the right kind of language. That's the right kind of model. I love the God is sort of the storyteller as well. I think that is huge. So man, I want to respect your time.
Well, thank you. This is great. We should. I would love. I don't know how we would coordinate it, but now that we've broke the seal, we're speaking to each other. Because I do like Rogan stuff. I mean, that's very what I do on my live streams now. It's very TLC centric, but it used to be. This is what I used to do all the time with just messaging apps with friends from this community or even before this community. And something like I'd watch a Rogan episode or something, and it would trigger all these thoughts.
Right.
And then I would just be like, here's 20 minutes of what I think about that.
I mean, that's essentially what I did too. I was looking for people to have these conversations with, but I didn't have that group of friends like you're talking about. I think if I did, I wouldn't have created a YouTube channel. I was like, there's got to be other people out there thinking these same things. So
Everything
let's see.
in its right time, man.
And it'll get really interesting here real quick, because I don't know. I'm keeping an eye. He usually releases his podcast at noon. And because he had Constantine on, and because Constantine was with Jordan Peterson, I have a suspicion that the Jordan Peterson
that's gotta
episode
be coming. He was saying, like, Jordan said something weeks ago, like, I'm headed
see you
for
soon.
you or
And
whatever.
Jordan was in Austin doing a part of his tour. I mean, it's got to come out today.
It'll be coming. It'll be coming sometime. It'll be
interesting to see who he interviews also after Jordan. So
yeah. Well,
definitely
episode 1 of Strange White Stones. Or whatever.
Love it. Yeah, I love it.
Okay. Well,
cool,
good.
man.
Thanks, buddy.
Have a good day.
Yep.
Talk to you soon.